According to my calculations, it's a Friday. And a little while back, I did a book report. I came out and I said, here's a bunch of books I read recently. And I said, let's talk about them. So it's a multi-book book report, but I read books. I read a lot of books. And I'm always plowing through one book or another. And so the good ones, which most of them are, I'm pretty good at picking books. The good ones, I'll come out here and talk about once in a while. And go, hey, here's a book I read. And if you're interested in the topic, that's what I have to say about it. So, for example, this book called Veritas. I don't know if you remember the controversy about somebody claiming to have found a piece of parchment that referenced Jesus' wife. And of course, if Jesus had a wife, well, the Da Vinci Code. So anyways, there's a big controversy about it. And this guy wrote a really, really good book called Veritas, a Harvard professor, a con man, and the gospel of Jesus' wife. It is very, very well documented to illustrate why the parchment was probably faked, and the person who was pushing it as real, the Harvard professor, appears to have kind of fallen for a hoax. And unfortunately, a lot of people were in an uproar one way or the other about this thing. And when the dust settled, here's a really good book that explains it. But when the dust settled, it wasn't real. But some people staked their careers on it, so that's not good. Now, a book called Cobalt Red, and this is one of these books which I wish got more attention. It was blurbed by John Krakauer, who said, Cobalt Red is a riveting, eye-opening, terribly important book that sheds light on a vast, ongoing catastrophe. Everyone who uses a smartphone, an electric vehicle, or anything else powered by rechargeable batteries needs to read what this author has uncovered. And here's the deal. There are some materials that are necessary for all of those items we just mentioned there. And some of it is quite rare and hard to come by. And as a result of that, there's a lot of abuses happening in the Congo where this stuff is coming from, and all kinds of problems that nobody likes to talk about. And so Cobalt Red is how the blood of the Congo powers our lives. And it's an eye-opening book. I'm surprised there's not more about this out there. But I've seen little bits and pieces about it. But it's the kind of thing that nobody likes to think about. When you buy your brand new iPhone or whatever it is, Android, whatever device you've got, you don't want to think about the fact that there's children working in horribly unsafe conditions for, pennies to get you the material for that phone. And some of it is quite disturbing, but you got to know about this stuff. You can't just turn a blind eye toward it and go, whatever. So it's an important book, and it's an amazing story. Now, I mentioned before I like reading World War II books, and I like reading everything from the overview histories of the global theater and so on, down to the first-person accounts of people who actually were there. And somewhere along the line, I became aware of the fact that Otto Skorzeny had written his own autobiography. And he, of course, he titled it Hitler's Commando. But many World War II historians would tell you that, yes, he's a very, very well-known individual. And so, for instance, when Benito Mussolini was arrested by the Italians and taken away and taken out of power, Hitler decided that it might be a good idea to save Mussolini, and he turned to Otto and said, can you go and rescue that man for me? And he did. And so Otto Skorzeny was involved in a lot of high-level type spy war type things. It's hard to describe what he did, but it says, in his subtitle, The Daring Missions of Otto Skorzeny and the Nazi Special Forces. And I do understand that when someone writes their own story, it's slanted heavily. I understand that. But I still think it's an important thing to realize that the story is out there. You can learn a lot from it without having to necessarily buy everything the guy says. But for instance, I'm sure you've heard that there was a plan to have German soldiers dressed in American Army uniforms infiltrate the lines during the Battle of the Bulge to sow confusion amongst the American troops. Again, that was a thing that he was in charge of. And interestingly, he was put on trial after the war was over. And the reason that he was found not guilty of committing a a war crime with that particular instance is the fact that an American testified and said, well, we did the same thing. So whether you agree with that or not, it's not up to me. I'm just telling you that that is what happened. But Hitler's Commando is a book I read. Like I said, I'll read the books written by anybody, but I will understand that, yeah, he's telling his own story and they lost the war. And he's also going to gloss over a lot of stuff because, as you can imagine, some of the activities he was involved in probably would not come across that well to an American audience. Now, here's another fabulous book I read. Roger Lowenstein wrote the book While America Aged, and he talks about pensions and how pension debt wound up doing things like taking down General Motors. It's driven up the cost in New York subways. It bankrupted San Diego, and it is potentially a looming crisis in our situation right now. Now, I'm not saying pensions are bad, and he's not even saying pensions are bad, but he's simply pointing out that pensions, unfortunately, are often not understood as well as they should be by the people who are negotiating them. And that is one of the situations that caused General Motors to go belly up not so long ago. So it's a fascinating book, While America Aged, Roger Lowenstein. Now, Newton and the Counterfeiter. My good friend David Dominy Fowler tipped me off to this book. And of course, you know about Sir Isaac Newton. He's a guy, quite famous, wrote some stuff, very, very important. I visited his gravesite at Westminster Abbey, and I'll put a picture in here if I remember to do so. But Newton, at one point in time, was given a very, very high title by the monarchy, and part of it involved him minding the mint. And in that job, he was also charged with doing what he could to fight counterfeiting. And so he wound up actually playing a little game of cat and mouse for a while with a guy who was a well-known counterfeiter. And you have to understand that in that day and age, counterfeiting was a capital offense. If you got caught and convicted, it was lights out for you. It was a very, very serious thing. But also, Newton was struggling with problems that England was having with its money, with its currency, with its actual money supply and how they were minting it. And so he was in charge of that also. So the subtitle is The Unknown Detective Career of the World's Greatest Scientist. And so it's an interesting angle that many people were unaware of, that, yeah, everyone knows that he, wrote those very, very important works. And some people heard that, yeah, I heard that he got a job with the mint. But as part of that job, it was investigating and trying to catch, in particular, one very, very well-known counterfeiter who wound up getting caught. So Thomas Levinson wrote that, highly recommended. I've mentioned before that I like movies, although I haven't been to the movie theater that much lately. Movies seem to have changed. But I'm fascinated by the movie industry because all of the moving parts and how it is that you get a movie to get made. And then when you hear a story about some movie that was really successful and how hard it was to get made, and then vice versa, you hear about some horrible movie that they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on, and it's bad, and you're like, how did that get made? Well, box office poison. Tim Roby. Hollywood's story in a century of flops. And he goes through here, and he gives some great examples of movies that were just horrible, horrible flops. And he'll start out by giving you some examples of he'll say, like, Intolerance is a movie that came out in 1916, directed by D.W. Griffith. It had a budget back in 1916 of approximately $2.5 million, and it grossed $1 million. And again, that's in 1916 dollars. And of course, those numbers climb over time, but some of these, and again, many of them are forgettable films. Nothing But Trouble. Director Dan Aykroyd. Budget $45 million. Worldwide gross $9.2 million. And so a lot of these movies you have heard of, some of them you've not heard of. But he gets into the whole story about oftentimes what went wrong, how it wound up being what it was. And some of them are famous, you may have heard of. Some of them maybe not so much. But, I've mentioned before, I like the movie Shakespeare in Love. Okay, Shakespeare in Love, I like that movie. And that movie won, I think, a pile of Academy Awards. I was going to take a guess at the number, but I don't want to do that because I'd probably guess wrong. But it won a stack of Academy Awards. And if you watch the movie and if you appreciate the movie, you understand how well put together the movie is. And it stands up to repeated viewings. And I've watched the movie many times. And somewhere along the line, I thought, I wonder what the story is about this movie getting made. It turns out that the script had been kicking around Hollywood for years, and nobody wanted to make it. And then finally, somebody came along and said, something, I wonder if Julia Roberts would like to make this movie. And she read the script, and she goes, yeah, I'll do that movie. But only if Kenneth Branagh plays Shakespeare, because he, of course, is the Shakespeare guy. So Kenneth Branagh read the script and goes, yeah, I'll do it. So they started preparing to do it with Julia Roberts and Kenneth Branagh, which would have been horrible. And then somewhere along the line, one of them couldn't do it because of a conflict and backed out. The other one backed out, and the project went into what they call turnaround, which means that one studio kind of started developing it, and any other studio can come along and pick up the development, but they may have to pay some of the costs of the previous. It's unclear. And it just kicked around, and finally Gwyneth Paltrow and Joseph Fiennes said they would do it. And at the time, Joseph Fiennes was relatively unknown. And there's a whole nother story about the intrigue that went on, whether or not Winona Ryder was going to play the role. It doesn't matter. The point is the movie got made, and it was a masterpiece. And yet you go, wait, they were having a hard time getting this movie made? And yet they'll make 19 Transformers movies? Like what? So there's a lot to unpack there. But Box Office Poison does really shed a light on how it works in Hollywood. This one right here, A Brief History of Timekeeping. Not A Brief History of Time. Brief History of Timekeeping by Chad Orzel. And it's the science of marking time from Stonehenge to atomic clocks. And it's fascinating because, I wear a watch. It's a mechanical watch. And I've told people that this is not as accurate as a quartz watch that you can buy for $3. Okay? And so the idea of keeping accurate time doesn't strike us as being that important because we take it for granted. And yet there was a time when it was not clear what time it was. And, so even up until the 20th century, there were people whose jobs it was to go from place to place and go set a watch and then go visit places and going, here's the time. I mean, huh? So it's fascinating. The guy does get into some very technical stuff explaining how an atomic clock works and so on. And, at what point they developed a watch or a clock that would travel, for instance, on the ocean, because that became very, very important for figuring where you were based on stars and time and so on. But it's absolutely fascinating. It's the kind of thing where when somebody mentioned that a book had been written, I'm like, what a great idea. I hope they did it well. And they did. So Chad Orzel, Brief History of Timekeeping. I've also mentioned in the live streams recently, I read this book, Brothers by Alex Van Halen. He's, of course, talking about him and his brother Eddie. Eddie passed away. And he tells this story about him and his family and his brother in particular, how they came to America as very small children, settled in California, wound up living in Pasadena, and they were raised by musical parents. The parents were very, very into music. And so they were made to take piano lessons. I think they took violin lessons. And at one point in time, Alex got a guitar, and Eddie had some drums. And then somewhere along the line, they realized that their talents lay, and they switched. And Alex became a great drummer. Eddie became a renowned guitar player. And they put together a band. They were touring and playing around the Pasadena area. Not touring, but playing clubs and parties and so on. Somewhere along the line, they met David Lee Roth. And then they also met Anthony, the bass player. And they put together their band. And he tells the entire story about all of the stuff they did before that happened, and then playing clubs in Hollywood, to very, very small audiences. And then finally how they did get discovered and signed a contract and their first experiences in the studio. And it explains a lot because I was a big fan of Van Halen. I've seen them live twice. I was backstage at the show years ago. And I saw them both times with Eddie playing guitar and David Lee Roth singing. And I was always curious about some of the choices they made musically. They put out an album that had a bunch of covers on it. And he explains that there was a time when they were constantly being pushed to create music. And they wanted to slow down a little bit, to take it easy. And then finally got to the point where Eddie built a recording studio on his property to where they could go sit in the studio and work at their own pace, and that's what they wound up doing. But the story basically ends around the time David Lee Roth leaves the band, and I've had people tell me that they're kind of disappointed that the book doesn't go beyond that. But he does tell quite a bit of the story. And of course, like I said, from them coming to America all the way up through Van Halen to when David Lee Roth leaves. So I think it covers a good portion of that, but it is an utterly fascinating story. And I love reading the stories about bands and how they made it. Again, it's Alex telling his own story, so I understand that some of that might be slanted a little bit in his direction. But he paints an interesting portrait of David Lee Roth, which coincides with what most of us always thought about David Lee Roth and his ego. And then finally, Number Go Up. I cannot recommend this book enough. If you're interested in crypto or NFTs or anything out there in the new cryptocurrency age that we're living in. Because Zeke Faux wrote this book, Inside Crypto's Wild Rise and Staggering Fall. And he wrote for a while, I forgot for whom, Bloomberg News, Bloomberg Business Week, and he lives in Brooklyn. And he was writing about this stuff, and he decided that he wanted to get to the bottom of one particular aspect of cryptocurrency, and it's this thing called Tether. And I'm not going to get heavily into it, but he made it his goal in life to track down the guy who runs Tether and figure out how real Tether is. But he winds up going to conferences, traveling around the world, ending up down in the Bahamas, interviewing Sam Bankman-Fried. He winds up in Switzerland. He's going all around the world. And one of the things he's trying to do is speak to people about Tether. And he wants to speak to people who work at Tether. But because it's a crypto existence, they could be anywhere or nowhere. We don't even know. But Number Go Up is one of those joke phrases that the people in the world of crypto use when someone asks, well, what do I need to understand? Nothing. Number go up. That you just buy it because the number go up. And it's one of those meme jokes, right? But it's fascinating because, among other things, he interviewed Sam Bankman-Fried. And if you don't know who he is, start watching the news a little bit, would you please? But second of all, I got to tell you that the book opens with, in the prologue, Sam Bankman-Fried told me, I'm not going to lie. And then the writer goes, this was a lie. NASA, Bahamas, February 17th, 2022. So it's an amazing book. I've mentioned before, I like economic history, books that explain things about economics and so on. And crypto is a big, big deal right now. So you got to understand that. So this book, fascinating story, explains a lot of it. And it was quite entertaining. And actually is a very, very fast read. I was surprised at how quickly I got through this book. So that right there is my second book report. I'll do another one in another 5 or 10 books. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.